How systems replace leaders without anyone noticing. Leadership is usually imagined as a person, a voice, a face, or a name that carries authority. But the most enduring power in the modern world no longer depends on individuals at all, because systems have learned how to absorb leadership functions so completely that removing the leader changes almost nothing. At first, this feels impossible. People expect direction to come from someone. They expect decisions to have an owner. They expect responsibility to be traceable. And for a long time, it was, but something changed quietly. To understand why this matters now, we need to look at how leadership actually functions under pressure. Leaders are slow. They are visible. They are constrained by personality, reputation, and mortality. Systems are none of those things. Among elite sheiks, leadership began shifting away from individuals not as a public reform, but as a survival strategy. They watched how leaders became liabilities under scrutiny, how attention fixed behavior, how pressure personalized blame. So instead of strengthening leaders, they strengthened processes. Decision-making was distributed. Authority was embedded into rules, defaults, and automated sequences. Outcomes were engineered to occur regardless of who was present. At first, leaders still appeared to lead. They signed documents. They made speeches. They represented direction. But beneath that surface, systems were already doing the work. Budgets executed themselves. Policies triggered automatically. Incentives guided behavior without instruction. Leadership became ceremonial. This transition is subtle because it does not feel like removal. No one is fired. No announcement is made. No vacuum appears. People continue showing up. Titles remain. Meetings still happen. But influence has already migrated. The sheiks understood that leaders attract resistance. Systems attract adaptation. You can oppose a person. You can challenge a decision-maker. But it is much harder to confront a process that appears neutral, technical, and inevitable. This is the opening reality. When systems replace leaders, accountability becomes abstract. When accountability becomes abstract, resistance loses its target. People no longer ask who decided. They ask how the system works. And by the time they ask that question, the replacement is already complete. But this shift introduces a new tension. If leaders are no longer essential, what happens when something goes wrong? Who absorbs blame? Who restores trust? Who intervenes when systems fail? That unanswered question is where the story truly begins. Because when leadership disappears without notice, its absence is only felt at the exact moment it is needed most. As systems take over leadership functions, responsibility begins to diffuse in ways that feel efficient on the surface, but deeply unsettling beneath. Because when no single person appears to be in charge, decision-making continues smoothly while accountability quietly evaporates. At first, this feels like progress. Processes become faster. Decisions become consistent. Outcomes feel insulated from emotion and ego. But consistency has a side effect. When no leader is clearly responsible, there's no obvious place for pressure to land. No single figure to persuade. No one to confront directly. The sheiks observed that this diffusion of responsibility created a powerful shield. Criticism arrived, but could not attach. Blame circulated, but never settled. Demands for explanations stalled in committees, procedures, and protocols. Systems answered questions with structure. Instead of reasons, they offered rules. Instead of intent, they offered process. Instead of discretion, they offered compliance. This reframed every challenge. Opposition that once targeted individuals now had to decipher machinery. Activism that once appealed to conscience now faced automation. And automation does not feel guilt. As systems matured, they learned to self-correct. Feedback loops adjusted thresholds. Metrics replaced judgment. Exceptions were absorbed statistically. Leadership functions dissolved further. Even crises failed to summon a central figure. Responses triggered automatically. Statements were issued generically. Responsibility remained distributed. This produced stability, but also distance. People began feeling governed, not led. The sheiks understood this emotional cost. They accepted it as a trade-off. Systems do not inspire. They persist, but persistence is power. Because While emotional leadership fluctuates, systems continue operating regardless of approval. This creates a new dynamic. Trust is no longer placed in individuals. It is placed in predictability. As long as outcomes remain tolerable, questions remain abstract. As long as systems function, few demand human intervention. But this tolerance is conditional, because the moment outcomes break down, people search for someone to blame. And when systems replace leaders completely, there may be no one left to absorb that moment. That unresolved tension would soon reveal the true cost of leadership disappearing into structure. The conflict surfaces the moment systems fail visibly, because when outcomes break down and there is no clear leader to confront, frustration has nowhere to land and begins spreading unpredictably across the entire structure. This is where abstraction becomes dangerous. People tolerate faceless systems when they function. They forgive inefficiency when it feels neutral, but they rebel against failure when it feels unowned. The sheiks understood that leadership disappearing into systems created a hidden vulnerability. When something goes wrong, systems cannot apologize. They cannot explain intent. They cannot absorb emotion. And emotion always seeks a target. As failures accumulated, even small ones, pressure intensified, not against a person, but against the idea of the system itself. Critics framed automation as indifference. Procedures were labeled cold. Neutrality was recast as avoidance of responsibility. This reframing was powerful, because without a leader to defend decisions, systems appeared unaccountable by design. No one could be persuaded. No one could be pressured morally. This created escalation. Demands shifted from reform to disruption, from dialogue to exposure. The sheiks faced a strategic dilemma: reintroduce visible leadership and restore emotional legitimacy, or double down on systems and risk alienation. Both options carried cost. Visible leaders invite pressure, but absorb anger. Invisible systems preserve continuity, but absorb resentment slowly. The sheiks chose containment over concession. Instead of restoring leadership publicly, they introduced symbolic figures, faces without authority, voices without control. These figures absorbed emotion without altering structure. The system remained intact. Criticism found a surface to strike, but nothing structural moved. This was deliberate. Leadership became a buffer, not a driver. It existed to receive blame, not to make decisions. This reframing stabilized the system temporarily, but revealed an uncomfortable truth. When systems replace leaders fully, leadership does not disappear. It mutates. It becomes emotional theater, separated entirely from power. And that separation carries risk, because once people sense that leaders no longer lead, trust fractures faster than silence ever could. The conflict was no longer about efficiency. It was about legitimacy. And legitimacy, once questioned, cannot be repaired by process alone. The next phase would decide whether systems could survive without reclaiming genuine leadership, or whether power would be forced to step back into view. The climax arrives when the system proves it can survive without ever restoring real leadership, because at that moment power completes its transition from human authority to structural inevitability. This is the point of no return. Instead of re-centralizing control, the system normalizes distance. Instead of appointing decisive leaders, it reinforces procedure. Instead of addressing legitimacy emotionally, it stabilizes outcomes mechanically. And slowly, resistance loses its target. People stop demanding answers from individuals. They stop expecting intention. They stop believing anyone is truly in charge. What replaces leadership is adaptation. Critics adjust expectations downward. Participants learn how to navigate rather than influence. Outrage fades into resignation. This is not victory through persuasion. It is victory through exhaustion. The sheiks understood that systems do not need trust. They need tolerance. As long as life continues functioning, as long as disruption remains manageable, as long as alternatives feel impractical, systems endure. Leadership becomes optional, not because it is unnecessary, but because it is inefficient. Individuals bring emotion, inconsistency, and risk. Systems bring repetition, insulation, and continuity. When systems replace leaders completely, power no longer rises or falls with personalities. It no longer reacts to scandal. It no longer collapses with reputation. It persists. The resolution is unsettling. Power does not disappear when leaders vanish. It concentrates. It relocates into code, into policy, into defaults that no one remembers choosing. And once power reaches that stage, removing it feels impossible, without dismantling everything that depends on it. That is a quiet ending. Leadership fades, systems remain, and influence continues, without ever announcing who holds it. This is why modern power rarely looks commanding. It looks technical, administrative, boring, and that boredom is a disguise, because the most complete control is the one that no longer needs a face. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? How